All right, we are live. Welcome to another episode of Roasting Marshmallows. My name is Rolf Zuid, and I am your host. So in the age of liberated companies, there are different models of governance where individuals are responsible to undertake actions on behalf of their company. With a participatory decision-making process and distributed leadership at its core, a sociocratic governance is at odds with the traditional vertical management system. A sociocratic organization allows the individual to express oneself within a group and allows the group to function in an autonomous and co-responsible manner. Sociocracy produces organizations that are both collaborative and highly productive. The process for decision-making is very different from majority voting that inevitably will lead to the majority rule. Because as with society, the majority rule easily leads to polarization and promotes competition and dominance instead of cooperation and equality. Using consent and collaboration as a foundation for decision-making and communications, sociocracy builds a strong governance structure that extends from the mailroom to the boardroom and from the client to the founders. So today we're roasting marshmallows with John Buck, co-author along with Sharon Valines of the book We the People, Consenting to a Deeper Democracy, a guide to sociocratic principles and methods. And he also was the co-author with Jutta Eckstein of the Bossa Nova book that we handled a few episodes back. John has had a career in management and government and corporations. He is now an expert advisor, helping organizations adopt dynamic governance. John found this new way of running organizations right here in the Netherlands, and he even taught himself Dutch in order to gain full access to the literature. Dus ik wil graag deze kans nemen om onze gast even in het Nederlands welkom te heten. Welkom John, en hoe is het met jou?
Dankjewel.
Yeah, so is it true that you just learned Dutch just to be able to gain access to the literature?
When I ran across Gerard Endenberg back in the 80s or early 90s, there was not a nice Google translator that you could dump all the literature into. And I found that the little bit that they had translated into English was terrible. And so I knew German. I thought, well, I'll just get my Warden book out and just start translating. And so if you ask me what's an afdeling, I can tell you that, it's a department. But if you ask me what this is, I don't know. And whenever I try to talk Dutch, I bring in German words because I had that in the gymnasium. Okay. And then the Dutch say, the border to Germany is right over there. Yeah. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag.
So that's why I think you haven't learned Dutch yet, because you can just use Google Translate.
Exactly, man. And I'm here for 11 years now, and I don't know even the basics. So it's impressive, John.
Yeah. Well, but Pancha, you actually did manage, right?
Well, you can be the judge of that.
Well, I can have a conversation with you in Dutch, so yeah, pretty good.
Yeah.
And as I was saying when we were chatting beforehand, there's a big plus to having learned the original Dutch, because I can say things in Dutch I can't easily say in English, and I have to spend a long time explaining some of the connotations that come with the Dutch words. So it's a really great conceptual language.
So,
right.
So for me, It sounds like you've had a really amazing motivation for yourself to learn, to broaden your knowledge of languages, just to deepen yourself into a concept of sociocracy. So I was curious, what is it about sociocracy that captivated you?
Yeah, probably I believed the teaching I got when I was a school kid about we were a democracy in the U.S. And so when I got my first job out of college as a technical writer at Boeing in Seattle, I liked the job. I liked my boss. I liked the people I was working with. I was being paid well. Work was interesting. And it hit me one day when I came back from doing voting for the local election in Seattle, voted for the mayor and all that, that I couldn't vote for my bosses at Boeing. And I said, how come? Why, if democracy is so good, why aren't businesses running democratically? And I thought, gee, I'd like to work for a democratic company. And I started doing some research on who has that. And I looked at things like the Mondragon system in the Basque area in Spain. And I said, there's something not quite right. And on that, and the next year they had a labor strike. I said, okay, they're not, it's not them. And so I went on to get a nice career at the Federal Aviation Administration and got lots of management training, and I could take whatever classes I wanted. And so I took lots of neat classes, but couldn't find anybody that was running democratically. And I built up a really early computer-based training program at the FAA and was over in Holland to give a speech about it. And I was talking with my host one night, and I was saying, I can't find this democratic company. And they said, problem's been solved. Go see Gerard Endenberg in Rotterdam. He solved it. So I went down there immediately. And within a half an hour, I could see he had something new. And so I thought, okay, this is like, let's go look at this further. And I made some more trips back to Holland, and I wrote a master's thesis on it because I wanted to, if I was going to get involved with it, I wanted to have data that said this is, actually effective. And I compared 5 or 6 Dutch companies with general sociological survey and had data that said, this causes people to be a higher level of commitment to the organization. I said, okay, there's lots more parameters, but let's go for it. And
did Gerard have really like the company in such a place where people could indeed vote for their bosses and everything?
Oh yeah. That's
Okay.
In sociocracy, you definitely can say, I object to that person being my boss, or let's do it this way, or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And it's a complex thing. It links to the American experience in that most people don't know that up until about 1850, the men would elect their officers in the U.S. Army. Okay. And so it's there in our culture, but then the Civil War happened and industrialization and all that, and it all faded away. But that's, you can certainly organize that way. And Gerard had a system based on cybernetics that does the trick.
Right. Interesting. Okay.
But why would, maybe that's a bit weird question, but why would I want to work for a company that is like in a sociocracy way?
Well, when they're operating, they're pretty successful. It's very hard to prove, that sociocracy causes this, but there's lots of correlations with success.
So it's related to, as you said, commitment. So people are more committed if they can elect their own bosses or leaders.
Right. But that's just one parameter. If you look at, are you more profitable? Well, it's very hard to prove the sources of profit, but the effectiveness maybe a little bit more. And so there's a number of really fine examples around of organizations that adopt it seriously and wholly that end up being much more agile and all kinds of other stuff. But they're in there, they hang in there.
Right. So the sociocracy is based on 4 pillars, and maybe we can talk about them a little bit so that maybe the people can have an idea of the concepts that are included. And so, because the first thing you already kind of mentioned it, where people object to a certain thing, and it's like consent-based decision making, right? Could you maybe explain a little bit how that works? Yeah.
In order to do so, I'm going to step back a little bit and give you Gerard's cybernetics.
Sure.
So there's just a quick history about him. He was raised by parents who, before World War II, were radical socialists. I think his mother was a famous actress and so on. After World War II, when socialism started sweeping the continent, European continent, his parents said, no, that's not what we were talking about. So they decided they would start their own management laboratory, their own company, and experiment with their ideas. And meanwhile, Gerard went to the Kindergemeinschaft, the children's workshop, which was run by a man named Kees Bucher, who had heard about sociocracy from the U.S. It had gone from Comte to the U.S. and then back to him in terms of people trying to work on it. So Gerard learned the basics of it in school. He went on to get a really good electronics degree and worked for Philips. The flat speaker that's in your telephone is, he got the patent for Philips on that.
Okay.
And so brilliant guy. And his parents had started an electrical company providing, I think it started out with lamps and that kind of thing. But today the company does maybe wiring up of a dam or a ship or a big building, that heavy electrical stuff. So when his parents decided they wanted to retire, they said to Gerard, would you come take over the company in our experiment? And he did. He left Philips. And he said he remembers very clearly looking at the power structure at Endenberg Electrotechnique. And it was, of course, the traditional top-down sort of thing. And he shook his head and said, as an electrical engineer, I would never design a power circuit that way. It has no feedback loop that can't be ignored. And like the thermostat on the wall of your house, you set it for 20 degrees. And if it falls below that, then there's a switch that goes on and turns on the furnace. And you cannot ignore the feedback that it's 19 degrees. And so there was no mechanism for that. So he said, all right, to be steerable, a system has to have a command system, but it also needs a feedback loop so you can adjust how you're commanding.
Makes total sense.
So then he said, all right, my problem then is how to build in a feedback loop that cannot be ignored. And so I think you said when you were introducing this like, oh, hierarchy and sociocracy are fighting each other. No, the hierarchy is one piece of the steering loop, lead, do, measure. And so what sociocracy does is it adds the feedback loop, and that puts everybody who's involved in the system, that is the company, able to say the system is not working, we have to fix it. So then he said, all right, in the command system, ultimately the boss says, I've listened to you, I'm a good participative manager, but I'm making the decision. He had to change that power structure. How do you build the feedback loop? And so he came up with the idea that in, let's say, any standard working unit, they would periodically stop and have a time to think, and he called it a circle meeting. A ring is different than circle in English, but it's close enough. I would rather call it a ring, but then you have ringleaders in English, which is can't have that.
The social circle.
But ring describes the closeness that you get operating this way much more than circle. Circle is French based, and they don't know how to say it like Anglo-Saxon, so ring is Anglo-Saxon. Anyway, they formed Krings, and in the Kring meeting or circle meeting, then you make decisions and he wasn't sure. How do they make decisions? It can't be majority vote, as you were saying. And he told me that he tried to solve this problem by going on a personal retreat, and he gave up. He couldn't figure out how do you actually make an egalitarian decision with the boss being present. And he gave up, and as he was putting in the suitcase into the back of the trunk of his car to leave, it hit him. He said, it's consent. And that's a systems-based concept. So if you are, it's the middle of the night and you have to drive to the store to get milk for the baby or whatever, you get in the car and you don't get in the car and say, car, do you agree we should go get milk for the baby? The car's not going to talk to you. It cannot agree with you. But if you get halfway there and the tire goes completely flat, the car has said, I have an objection. I can't consent to go, because if you go, then it's a $3,000 wheel job because you're going to ruin the rim and so forth. And so now you have to think, okay, how do I solve this objection? Maybe you put on a spare tire, maybe you go get an Uber or whatever. And so the system can object even though it can't agree. It can say this isn't working. And that's consent. And it's not consensus, which asks for agreement. It's acceptance. In the U.S. Declaration of Independence, there's a phrase that says governments exist by the consent of the people, and it's not the consensus of the people. It's like they'll put up with it. You can put up with some pretty awful things. So it's a systems-based concept, and that means that when you're having this circle meeting, which is pretty much like a retrospective in Agile, you are saying, this is happening. Do we want to keep working this way, or is there an adjustment that's needed? I can't consent to this happening because so on and so forth. And you then, every piece of the system has to consent to whatever you come up with, the boss, the janitor, whatever. And the consent then becomes the arguments that you offer. This is what's proposed as a decision, and I don't consent to it because. The because could be you have a bad feeling about it, which is why the Dutch is valuable. The bezwaar, means heavy. The objection in English is just like, okay, it's an intellectual argument, but the Dutch meaning is important. And so you may have bad feelings about it, and everybody says, "Oh, John, what do you have tension in your shoulders, your stomach bad? But what's this about?" And it's this and it reminds me of that, and then everybody begins to understand it. The practical outcome of that is that very often when that happens, everybody goes, aha, let's do this. And the decision will shift. It can help transformative learning where you're doing framework shifting.
Yeah.
And so it's not a veto. It's the beginning of a creative process when you have an objection.
I can imagine it requires some psychological safety of the circle of people that are discussing an idea, right? Because if your boss, gives this an idea and you don't dare to point out your bezwaren or your objections. Is that also part of sociocracy, building some psychological safety, or is it like a whole different field in itself?
No, that's definitely part of it. And I'll give an example of it being overcome, and that was an assisted living facility where a friend of mine was running it, and she wanted to go sociocratic, and so we had some training, and then at the point where I was gone, they were running a circle meeting, and the people in this meeting, it wasn't a big facility. The people there were typically middle-aged women, many of whom maybe hadn't completed high school, coming from fairly rough circumstances, before had worked in places where it was like an abusive employer relationship. And so in the meetings, they would sit there like this. And that happened for a couple of meetings. And the third meeting, one of the women, this was like a care facility for elder people, and so they were doing, all the linen and all that kind of thing. She held up a towel, and she said, and it was threadbare, little holes in it. She said, "We need new towels." And my friend said she could see the other people looking at her, thinking, expressing the thought, "You're going to be fired for running your mouth." Yeah. So she, of course, said, "Oh, wow, I didn't realize that. Thank you. We'll buy new towels." And everybody's like, "You didn't get fired." And so they went from that, and the women began gradually to, loosen about it. And within a year, they were starting to get awards, state level awards for quality of care, because all the thinking that was happening, great ideas and innovations. So that's typical. We've got lots of baggage from the way we're normally operating.
And it takes quite some time to get over it. And I suppose also the role of facilitator in those. Oh, is this better?
Yeah.
No,
not really.
No.
Good. Yeah. Now it's better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Hick. So it takes quite a while to change a dynamic in history that all of us, or the group carries with ourselves. What would the role of a facilitator one of these meetings be? Wouldn't it also be to make a bit of a safe environment and give everybody equality of voice?
Yeah. We've got procedures that when we train facilitators, we try to go through that with them. Under our program, if we are training somebody to be a certified facilitator, it's 60 hours of training, which is about, if I go and want to do mediation at a local mediation center around here, the training is about 50 hours. It's the same equivalent kind of thing. There's lots of very specific things to learn. And the one of the things you do in a circle meeting is you go around in a circle, making sure that everybody gets a chance to talk. If it's on Zoom, you make sure that you've got all those pictures having a chance to talk, and they don't have to talk, but everybody gets a chance to talk. And that means that you have some controls on the people who like to talk a lot, and you have to interrupt them, and you have a fight for the floor, and a lot of people just say, "I'll just sit back and let them talk." So that's doing around, simple as it seems. People, when they learn about sociocracy, go back to the office and make sure everybody talks, and they said it makes a big difference, just that one thing. But there are other skills to learn, like, okay, how do you resolve an objection where you have, one person says we got to turn to the right, another says we got to turn to the left, or the window needs to be both, it needs to be open, and another one says shut. How do you deal with that? And so there are other helpful concepts to be able to resolve those in a way that's really fair, and everybody sees is okay, everybody was honored. And things like awareness that people all have blind spots, and you fill in blind spots. You can say it's obviously A, B, C, but you forget that it's B and a half. You overlook that. Another concept that's really important is both and thinking. If somebody says, okay, I want to turn the car right, and somebody else says turn it left, how do we both turn it both right and left at the same time? As opposed to arguing, is it better to go right or left?
Because I think these problems that you're describing, to me, I see them every day, right? Like you go to a meeting, they are discussing, and everybody wants to go to a different direction. I don't think it's per se unique to sociocracy to have that problem. So I guess you guys have a different solution to solve that problem. Is that how I should understand sociocracy?
Yes, it's not unique to sociocracy, because the concept of both and thinking was first advanced in 1980 by a book called Getting to Yes by Bill Urey. It's kind of the Bible of mediators. And so it's just a really great tool to know. We are trained, here's a question, and the scale of justice, this is a heavier argument, so it's got to be this way instead of that way. And we're trained to think either or. But if you ask, given two different arguments, how do we do both? You have an entirely different thought process. Yeah. And it's really important to know that.
So I think I can speak for myself, but I think also speak for us. The book that you wrote with the Utah was sort of really pivotal in our understanding and perceiving Agile. We've all been involved in it for plus 10 years, 10 to 15 years, each and every one of us. And we've seen project after Agile project not really achieving what it's supposed to achieve. Mm-hmm. And when reading the book where you put together agility, beyond budgeting, open spaces, and sociocracy, kind of a lot of things clicked. What is your take on it? Why have a lot of attempts at agility brought this bitter taste to the word agile? Let's put it that way.
The Agile solved the problem that they were trying to develop software in a design fashion. The waterfall approach. When I was doing computer systems management, I studied all that. You have a programming document, and you have a strategic plan, and you have all this stuff, a testing document, and then you start doing your programming, and it never produced anything. And so the idea that software development was complex and that you couldn't plan it out like you could design an aircraft or something was a big breakthrough. And so you had to have tools that were appropriate to complexity. And the problem that Agile runs into is that the complexity is not what a normal organization is designed to handle. It's top down. We have a good concept. And so when the manager of the bank says, I want a new computer, system in a year, and you have, $5 million to put it in, tell me what your schedule is. The software people come back and say, well, no, I can tell you next 2 weeks what we're going to do, but we don't know when we're going to be done or how much it'll cost. Sorry about that. And the bank manager fires them, brings in more software people that say the same thing. So there's this big clash. And to have company-wide agility, you need to be able to conceive of the process of a business as complex as opposed to something that you can do as an engineer, design everything. And that, when Agile came in, it never solved that larger problem. And so when the Agile people, the software people are allowed to, just run on their own, then it's okay. But there's always this collision between things being software and other things.
Yeah, that's exactly our experience. So that's why we immediately tried to consume everything we could relate, regarding to sociocracy, open spaces, beyond budgeting, because it was seems to be completing a whole picture that a lot of our efforts in the past have gone sort of in vain and have been a cause of a lot of frustration. But
when Utah and I were writing that book, and we didn't put it in the book, we created a grid, and we had beyond budgeting, sociocracy, open space, and agile over here. And then we said we've got to relate them. So we took the 4 manifesto principles here, and we said, how does beyond budgeting talk about, software, working software over documentation? What's their version of it? So we were able to fill in the whole chart. You could say those 4 concepts with any of the approaches. And so we then kind of tried to synthesize that chart to say, how do we really combine these into something that works for all the different facets of the business? Like if you have an annual budget, you are not an agile company, period.
No.
Why? Well, okay, what do you do about that? So the beyond budgeting language is much more suited to address the budget question than other things.
I think you guys did a good job connecting the dots there. And like one part that, going back to this, that triggers me a bit is, let's say, does a company have to start as a sociocracy company? Can a company become a sociocratic company?
It's a terrible marketing name. Nobody can spell it or
it's
say
like
it.
really hard. And then I think my question is more like, have you also experienced that you are in a sociocratic meeting and then suddenly everybody has their consent and then the boss say, no, I go my way?
That group doesn't last very long if that happens. The boss has to be trained. The boss has to understand, along with everybody else, and the boss is in a crucial position. The boss has to appreciate that I have to have a solid feedback system. There are things I cannot see.
Yeah, so this cannot happen like bottom up. It has to be in a way a top-down decision to go on sociocracy level.
It's a systems-based approach, and so bottom up is not systems; it's just bottom up.
Right. But I can imagine a boss saying like, "Oh, but now I have this external circumstance that I have no control about that makes me, have to force a decision here, for the existence of the company or whatever."
Yeah. The practical solution to that is that the policies you set in your circles are not going to cover every circumstance, and so if the boss says, okay, the building's on fire, I'm not going to go get consent to get everybody out of the building. I'm just going to do it.
Yeah.
What you do if you do that is you call a circle meeting as soon as you can and say, this is what I did. You don't have a policy for it. I want to talk about it so we can handle it in the future, but this is what I did.
Yeah.
And right or wrong, and we can fix what was wrong, but this is what I did, and that's okay.
So that means that the transparency in the company, it has to be paramount, right? You have to have full transparency in your company in order for these meetings to have any effect. Is that sometimes also difficult for companies to achieve? Because there are of course trade secrets and certain levels of clearance that people need to have and all this stuff.
Transparency is not that all information is available to everybody all the time.
Okay.
For one thing, that's too much information, and you can just hide things by, it's right here, but it's buried down here also.
Sure. Yeah.
So they as Endenburg was experimenting with this, they ran across a situation where their overhead rate was being kept secret because they wanted to be able to bid successfully on a contract. And if it was all over the company, then their competitors would find it out and they would bid, $100 less and get the contract. So there was some objections in one circle. And so what they did is they elected somebody that everybody trusted to go look at the books and see and where he could see what the overhead rate was. And he came back and said, yeah, there's no tricks happening. So you have to have the information available that you need to make the decisions in your circle.
Yep. Makes sense.
And there should be no insurmountable barrier to that.
So you mentioned earlier you made a reference to the introduction that Rolf wrote, that like the structure, the circle structure or the ring structure with the hierarchical structures, they're not necessarily the opposing factors to one another, but they need to basically coexist, and there is purpose for both type of structures. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Because one thing, at least for me, when I found out a lot more about sociocracy, is that actually sociocracy finds place for all different ways of making decisions, not just sociocratic decisions, and there is room for each approach, even autocratic, maybe even democratic, but they all need to be taken in its own context. So maybe you can explain a bit about the context in which these take place.
I try, when I have the luxury of no COVID and can teach live, I like to do an exercise where I get everybody outside of wherever we are on a field or a lawn, and I say, I want you to get this in your bodies. And I will, maybe if it's 30 people, I'll have them stand in 4 lines or 5 lines, whatever, and one military fashion. And I'll say, like, okay, this is one way of organizing. Everybody take a step to the left. Everybody does that really easy. Everybody take a step to the right. Fine. So I said, I can, by commanding you, move the whole group. And so there are some pluses in that. What are they? Oh, accountability and so on. I said, what does it feel like to be at the very end of the line? I'm hiding. I don't like it back here. Okay, so this has pluses and minuses. It feels good some ways and doesn't feel good other ways. And then I'll have them sort of spread the lines out a little bit and have the back of the line curl up to the middle. So we now have like a clover leaf of 4 circles, and the inner circle, the general circle, will have the person who is at the head of the line, the boss or the supervisor, standing right next to the person who is at the back of the line. And so then there's a circle there of those people, and then there's the broader circle. And I say, you can choose to be this way. And in this way, we now have circles, and we can make decisions by consent, and then the inner circle will help us make decisions for everybody. And there's more to it than that, but then very often I'll have them all hold hands like this, and then we back up, and voila, we're standing in a huge circle. And so I'd say, this is we the people, everybody looking at each other in a circle. We can choose to stand and form whatever we're doing in the way that works best for our objective. And all the different possible ways of structuring ourselves, it's up to us what we can consent to.
Yeah.
So a sociocracy group could say, I want to be now in a command and control fashion for this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That would be for a
have to go
specific
for the
issue
same.
or a specific domain. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Just a simple example of that, like there's a really nice school in North Carolina called the Rainbow Community School. And it's like I've got data and tests that are done, and the kids are way above everybody else. Lots of successful stuff there. But the director, when they were putting this in, they were going along for a while, and then they had a budget crunch, and she laid off somebody. And the faculty was up in arms because they said, wait a minute, I thought we were running sociocratically, but you're just laying off somebody. This is all a trick. And Renee said, you're right. That's the way we used to do it. Let's see how we want to do it. And so they formed a committee that sat down and worked and said, how do we want to deal with a situation where somebody is to be fired or laid off or, some adverse personnel action? And when they got into it and saw all the mess that you get in when you have that kind of thing, they said, we really don't want to be in on that. But what we do want is we'll elect 2 or 3 senior teachers. And whenever you have to do a adverse action, you need to talk with them. Not that they're going to tell you what to do, but you need to bounce off of them so they understand. And then you may not be able to say, I'm firing so-and-so because they did this illegal thing. And so you're just firing somebody and we don't know about it. But if the top teachers say, it's okay, this is the transparency thing, I agree with this decision, then we'll go along with it. And so they invented that themselves. That's how we want to do it. We delegate to you all this messy stuff, but we want some sort of insight.
Okay. Because like one of the customers that I work with, they have this normal hierarchical thing, and they create those expert groups or expert leaders or whatever in some specific areas. And if people has a question or decision, is made in that group. But the issue I have with this is that those groups, they are not per se made by a sociocracy way, right? So they are elected by top down, and then all the decisions goes through these guys. And what am I missing here? Like, how is that different than from the sociocracy? It's just that the lead is elected.
Right. The lead is elected from below, everybody gets a chance to consent to who's going to be the representative that gets this privileged information. And that's very different than the director saying, oh, I like you, you, and you.
Yeah.
That it's quite different.
Yeah.
So, you're also active in exploring an idea with Erasmus of neighborocracy, and I'm assuming that's more implementing sociocracy in other social structures than companies and organizations.
Mm-hmm.
How is that working out? Like, can you scale sociocracy to the socios, to the society?
Yeah. To the socios, yes. I'm in the process of working on a book. I'm nearly done with it. I'm co-authoring it with a man who has a long United Nations career, and who's from Africa. So we've been getting lots of chance to compare cultures. But the name of the book is "Governance from Below: Can Children Lead the Way?" And so it's both about the fact that children are the most disenfranchised group in all of society, and they actually have a lot to say and can say it effectively politically. And, you know, we are missing a lot because children can actually see things adults can't see. And so there's that component, but it's also, there needs to be a voice from below to, and I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, to really secure society. This idea is related to Gandhi's ideas of what, you know, building from the village from below up. Gerard Endenburg had a diagram where companies would have their top circle people get together, and they would get together, and so there's a structure going up to organize society. A man named Father Edwin John in India, Tamil Nadu, invented the same thing. And it's amazing to see their two diagrams next to each other. They're almost identical, that they were unaware of each other. I connected with Edwin John maybe about 10 years ago. I've been over there and worked with him. He has something called a neighborhood community network concept. And it started when he was a young priest and was assigned to work with a village in India where they had lots of crime and corruption and that sort of thing. And he proceeded by organizing neighborhoods, and by neighborhoods I mean no more than 30 families, and having them have parliaments, and he basically came up with consent decision making. And then if you have 30 of those, then they have representatives to the next level. And he took that town up to 3 levels, and within a year they had solved the problems. The town was, you know, much better because everybody was able to control their immediate environments and then the next level, and they could, if somebody was at the higher level was doing what they didn't want, they could pull them back immediately. There's no need for like a special recall election or anything. They just pull them back. And he talked with the people who were over in Kerala about this, and they were developing something called the Kudumbashari system, where they were trying to organize poor women initially, and they set up the same structure. Today in Kerala, there's a few 100,000 neighborhood parliaments, and they are federated up 3 levels. I think they'll go beyond that to the whole government at some point, but in Kerala right now, the majority of the local politicians in the regular system are now women, which is very unusual in India. So we have these examples of organizing neighborhoods, and the most successful version of that has been to organize children. There's actually a child prime minister of India that's spoken to the UN. And so I helped them get the attention of places like the Sociocracy Zentrum in Vienna, and some other places in Europe. And so they are now trying to replicate what they've been doing in India through the Sonic or the Erasmus fund effort. I think there's 9 countries involved. And so it's related to like co-housing. Co-housing is kind of organizing neighborhoods, but it's not ever formed a system where, you don't go build special houses, you just organize a neighborhood. There are lots of challenges in the Western culture to be able to do this. You don't just, it's normal to not know the names of the people that live 3 houses from
Even
you.
one.
Yes.
And you've lived there for 5 years. And so the individualism in the Western culture pushes against that, but they're poking at it. So why is it a secure system of governance? It's now that we have so much happening electronically, you really don't know who you're dealing with electronically. You're open for manipulation. You're open for all kinds of baloney coming in. But if it's a group of 30 people or less, then you know those people and you know whether you can trust them or not. And so you have the control by people who know each other. You're not having to talk through microphones or anything. And I think that system is what we need to counteract the downside of all the electronic communication. We really need to be grounded in local direct contact with each other.
But so then let's say on a municipality level, this is a really interesting example for me. So you have neighborhoods organizing themselves in representatives to make some decisions about the neighborhoods. What do we want to, how do we want to see the future of our neighborhoods? Of this street, for instance. Then you have the neighboring street doing the same, and then you elect representatives that then form a higher up circle. Then they deal with a larger area. Then you are still. There is no other way, obviously, because the people who make the bottom decisions are still detached far from the decisions that are being made few circles higher. Mm-hmm. My question would then be, wouldn't that essentially be very similar to how society runs today?
No. The way society runs today is the people who make those big, broad decisions get elected by majority vote. Mm-hmm. Oh, we have 100,000 people electing somebody. How do I speak to 100,000 people? Well, I need the equivalent of a microphone. I've got to, put out media and all that kind of thing.
Right.
We're now into money. And so, I'm fundraising. Well, Mr. Rich person down the street, how'd you like to kind of help me in here? And suddenly all the purity or the integrity is down the tubes. And so if you're going from the bottom up, you have a number of things like subsidiarity, meaning that the problems get pushed to the lowest level, and you have an immediate recall, so that if somebody really is not doing anything, you can pull them back. Right now, you elect somebody, 100,000 people elect somebody, you don't like them, then you have to have a recall, or you wait till the end of the 5-year term, and so they're much less responsive.
Yeah, so the feedback that you mentioned is not there in the way how it is now.
Right.
And it also would require also participation on local level by everybody, because in a lot in Western societies right now it is that people just don't really care sometimes.
Well, but then the question is why, right? Because is that because you are not part of it, your voice is not per se heard because you gave your vote, or is it because people really just don't care?
Yeah,
right today, everybody I know in the West is too busy.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a control tool. You have to work really hard, or you have to do all these things, or you're encouraged to do that. And you're not encouraged to actually sit and think, to have a retrospective with your neighbors. Yeah. That's just not there.
Should I run my family in a sociocracy way?
Oh, yes. Yes, we have lots of successful examples of that. And children love to be in there. And teenagers don't love to be in there unless you talk about the family budget and their allowance, and then they're right there.
Do you have to have a group to have a sociocracy, or is it like a couple could have a sociocracy thing? When do you define that is a sociocracy a fit?
Right. I have experimented with trying to teach people how to have a circle meeting with themselves, and when I've done that, I'll put maybe 4 or 5 chairs around, and we'll identify different parts of their personality, like adult, child, a parent, and all that. And then I'll have them sit in one chair and say, "This is what I think." And then they maybe move to the child's chair. The child says, "You're keeping me you're so busy, you never have time to play, and I like to play." And so it's pretty scary because when I've tried to do that, people generally end up in tears.
Can imagine that, yeah.
And I've experimented with them having a top circle, of the other people, and they and so you can do it. It's pretty heavy stuff, but I'm not a psychologist, so I tend not to do that, not to go there.
Yeah.
Well, my experience so far with Sociocracy, and I did the training that was organized by your institute, it was that it can be quite emotionally charging process because a lot of things come up.
Yeah.
So, but I'm assuming also the consent decision making process and the steps that you need to take. That could be actually helpful also for an individual, also for couples. So first you present a proposal,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're not in the first step. We're not gonna try to define solutions to this problem, but we're gonna ask questions, and that's like, let's try to give a shape of this whole problem that we have, try to understand it, then have a discussion about it, and then try to come up with some sort of solutions to it.
Well, you tried, so right, with your family already.
I did. I did to some extent. We had to make a decision or something, and normally people want to jump right away into problem-solving mode, or into, do I agree to this? And it's like, stop. We're not going to talk about, do you agree? We're going to talk about, do you disagree? Do you have an objection if the rest do this? And it like completely shifted the perspective. So you don't have to be up for it, but don't be against it. And that helps move few things along the way. So that was quite nice.
What I like is that you can bring in all kinds of neat technologies for this. There's let's say, appreciative inquiry, or dragon dreaming, or Kepner-Trigo problem solving, or 6 hats, or whatever. They all fit into that. Yeah. They're all ways to help, like, see what's the problem or start brainstorming solutions and all that. So it's that general process just captures a lot of the thinking that's been being developed for a lot of people for over some time.
And I think, let's say somebody is listening now and they think, okay, Sociocracy sounds really great. How do we go about trying to introduce some of this into our organization? So can you start introducing some of the principles on a team level as an individual, which without always having buy-in from the top? What are the risks of that? What can people do?
Yeah, that's at least in part addressed by the book that Jutta and I wrote, where we spend the last third of the book talking about doing probes. And that's a disciplined thing. So, okay, there's this principle of sociocracy and maybe a little bit of beyond budgeting. What if we tried doing this? Here's our hypothesis. We try it out. Oh, what happened? So you can approach it that way, and it works. I had a call from or a contact. It wasn't a call. It was an email from somebody who runs a software company in Brazil who said, "Hey, 5 years ago, you guys were teaching me this probing stuff, and I just want to let you know I owe you a thank you for that." He said, "We just finished having the company of 50 people together, making a decision about how we were going to give raises next year. And we got to that by probing at it and saying, what if? And it really works well. But, thank you for that." And so doing the rapid prototyping, being very disciplined about what you're doing, talking with others or publishing, what you've done so you get feedback, that's all good ways to go. And then you can decide, do I need a consultant to help me with this? Or, what are we going to do? We'll read up and research. It doesn't, stick you with the choice only of, I'm going to try to fake it, based on reading a book or get an expensive consultant. You can grow it yourself.
And what kind of problems should a company have when they should consider going to a sociocracy model? Is it like universally applicable, or is it like when they have an issue with employee satisfaction or like an efficiency problem? Like, what motivates companies to move to a sociocracy? Because, the guy making the decision could get elected away, right?
Yeah.
Or the person, I should say.
After doing some consulting, I've reached the conclusion that there is a larger variation in the personalities of companies than there is variation in human personalities. It's like all over the place. And so it's not just problems, it can be opportunities. How do we stay ahead of the game? What do we see this coming? What do we do to adjust? Okay, let's make this decision together or try it out and that kind of thing. So I can't answer the question. There's no one thing. It's like, if it hurts here on your left ankle, then, wrap a bandage around it.
Cut your ankle out.
Easy.
Yeah, right. Cut your ankle out. Right. Yeah.
Well, the thing that when I speak with people about sociocracy, at least a few things that I've read it in the small training I did with you guys as well. Sometimes people say like, it's about having no management. Is that the case? And I think I sometimes get confused with Zappo's holocracy. What is the difference?
Brian Robertson was a client of mine at one point when he was at Ternary Software. And then he decided that he had a better way to do it. And some of the things he does are really cool. He's a great marketer. And he also, I think, made some mistakes. But it's to be expected. I mean, there's various people trying out different varieties of sociocracy. Sociocracy 3.0, circle forward, the holocracy are all like, here's a neat thing. And it's
a branch of
testing out
sociocracy.
the environment. But at Zappos, I think there was a big mistake to say, now we're going to be holocratic. And 15 or 18% of the company left and said, no, I'm not. And so it's my experience much better to say, let's try this out. We'll try a couple of circles. If that works, then we'll try some more. And we'll adapt it as we go. And it's something we're doing, not something that the boss is ordering us to be equivalent.
Yeah, so you think the way how they made it is, could have been better, but the sense then what would be the difference between because when I read this whole holocracy, I understand it's there is no manager somewhere. And with sociocracy, there is some management still, right? There is the hierarchical layer in it.
It's not true there's no management in the holocracy. They disguise it. But for example, if you have a group, a circle, whatever they're going to call it, it says in the holocracy constitution, only the boss, the supervisor can make strategic plans. You can only come in with your tensions. It's like, okay, where's the boss in that picture? Yeah. So the thing is that work, regardless of what it is, happens at different levels of abstraction. You can be hammering a nail in a board, but then, what's that for? It's for a house. Okay, there's a plan for the house. Well, the house is part of a housing community, and so it has to follow. And so there's all kinds of levels of work when you're hammering a nail in a board. And the abstract thinking is something that takes time and preparation and some skill. And if you like hammering, the wood and sawing, and that's where your skill is, knowing how to really make that work, you're not going to be interested in, or maybe the best person to be handling the abstract stuff. You've got to handle it at all levels.
Yeah.
And so the nature of work is hierarchical. And so you have to take that big circle of people and say, all right, given that we've got hierarchical work, how do we want to organize? Even though we're still a circle, we're going to break it down in ways that work.
Yeah, and I think that's a part.
And so you literally,
that I get a bit confused sometimes because I think I understand, correct if I'm wrong, so the hierarchical part of the work, right? When I think those are normally the reasons why I see, for example, command and control. There is this guy who is an expert, and then he basically, let's just get a very simple example. He's going to dictate which tool or which tooling is going to be used from an IT company because, he is the expert. And then this goes all top down. And then when you talk with them, the reason why we don't ask is because these people don't know. So we just have to tell them what to do. And I think that's for me when it gets the conflict of, can it a sociocracy thing works without experts or competence, or how this would be if you just have one competent people, or at least has the skills, and everybody else is quite new to the job.
if it's sociocratic, at some level, everybody has consented for that expert to be the boss. And every few weeks they have a circle meeting or a retrospective and say, boss, this is working pretty well, but you're screwing up here and here. We want you to act differently. We change your remit as to what you can do. Okay. The boss says, okay, all right, and I consent to that. All right, we'll try this out. So there's the boss who's just directing is human, has blind spots, it has limitations, and cannot see everything, and so needs the feedback loop to be a good steerer.
Yeah.
All right.
I think I understand.
So, go ahead, Panche.
So we talked about circles and how do you build a circle? Would a circle, can you equate circle to a team? Can you equate a circle? Would then what if one, let's say, manager is responsible for multiple teams? Would there be like multiple circles and the manager is a part of? How would that start working in an organization?
It's the classic thing with the Endenberg, top-down diagram with no matrix and, cross-functional teams. If you leave that out for the moment, then each circle has its common doel. And I'm saying the Dutch word as opposed to the English, because Dutch say doel, and they mean target, aim, purpose, goal, objective, and all those crazy English words that you can't quite, doesn't nail it down. So they have a common doel. The best translation we've been able to make is aim. And an aim is a product or service that is differentiated from other products and services, and the customer understands it and likes it. And so you're doing something, and that's the glue that holds you together, is your common aim or dual or purpose. And so if you have a unit that's been broken down in a big organization with a supervisor and some people working for the supervisor, boom, there's your common dual, your common aim. And so you need to be making decisions about how are we working together. You're semi-autonomous. You're in a part of a bigger structure, but hey, we're going to program the way we want, or whatever they're doing. And then, yes, if you have a manager who's supervising supervisors, who then, then you create 4 or 5 circles, and they have representatives, and they have a general circle, and it can build up that way. I think the largest,
because this is sort of a way to transition maybe a common hierarchy into sort of a circle structure. Can you do it the other way around?
You overlay the circle structure on it.
So yeah, exactly. So that's quite, at least in my mind, is quite straightforward. Can you do it the other way around? Like define some sort of hierarchical structure from a circle structure?
Sure. Yeah. You can change that hierarchical structure. The circle structure can change the hierarchy anytime it wants.
Huh.
So the example I gave of the school where the teacher said, we want you to, consult with us, was changing the hierarchical structure. They had an objection to the way it was operating, and so they changed it. But you then get into things like cross-functional teams and all of the really neat concepts that have flowed out of the Agile. Then you end up having circles that go horizontally rather than vertically.
Yes.
And then that becomes a fun design challenge to how does that work? But so it's like one software company I worked with was doing a whole bunch of programming for a customer, and they all had to share one server. So you had different programming teams, but each team had an expert on the server, and they would get together horizontally and set policy for that server. And they didn't need to have an extra representative. They just had somebody who they elected as the head of the server team who sat in the next higher level. So that's one way where you work in the horizontal circles.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, I think with that one, we can maybe wrap things up a bit here. If people want to learn more about this stuff, are the books that you helped co-wrote a good starting point, or should they look somewhere else?
They can read those books. Yay! Commercial break here. And while I'm on that, if you look on the governancealive.com, or get hold of Jutta, and I'm not sure. I should have Juta's email address.
Yeah, I can put it in the notes. We have it as well.
We still have it. Yeah.
If you're in Europe, go see Yuta. If you're in the U.S., come see me. If you're in India, either one of us is fair game, and so on. But there's a lot of people now who understand it. We're moving people towards certification. We've got the International Sociocracy Certification Board,
right?
As the ISCB.earth, I think. Vienna's in there. There's a number of organizations that are kind of clustered, are allied to try to bring this kind of thinking, not just sociocracy, but I'll be having a conference in a couple of weeks with a bunch of people from Beyond Budgeting, and we trade information back and forth. So there's a whole complex of people that are there to help out.
All right. Cool. Well, we'll include the resources in the description for people to take a closer look at. John, I'd like to thank you very much for taking time out of your day to share your experience and knowledge about sociocracy with us and with our audience. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks a lot for joining us. I really clarified a lot of things in my head.
Yeah, for sure. And I also, of course, want to thank the listener for tuning in as always. If you have any suggestions or questions, feel free to send us an email at podcast@4scouts.nl. You can also reach us on Twitter, twitter.com/4scouts. John, Book, thanks again very much, and talk to you guys later. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Scoutcast, Roasting Marshmallows, with your host, Rolf Surd. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit 4scouts.nl and on Twitter @4scouts. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time on Scoutcast, Roasting Marshmallows.